right. Hi, everyone. This is Brad Cummings from Chair. I'm here with creative director here at Chair, Donald Mustard. How are you doing today, Donald?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for joining. We're really excited to have you here. I know there's been a lot of, even since I've started, a lot of lore questions about the Infinity Blade universe, and we're happy that you're here to answer some of those today.
Yeah, we that's not something people tend to not really be that interested in the story, so we never really get that many questions about lore.
It's more about the skill-based stuff,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
Well, there
right.
definitely is. That's pretty popular as well. Um, cool. So before we get started, we just thought we'd maybe answer some of the most common questions we get that aren't exactly lore-based, but
Sure.
every day people are asking. So the first one is, where is Infinity Blade 4?
Infinity Blade 4. Well, I'm sure all of you watching have heard us already say that we're currently not working on Infinity Blade 4. The whole team at Chair is busy working on a really awesome new intellectual property that's not set in the Infinity Blade universe. We're actually getting pretty close to being ready to announce that new project. So stay tuned for that, you know, in the future. But we'll definitely keep continuing to support Infinity Blade, and we have lots of plans for the future. But right now we're focused on something different.
Cool. Well, I think that's a good answer. Um, so the second question is, a lot of people ask about Infinity Blade Dungeons, which actually was not a Chair game. Can you tell us a little bit about that project and how it's going?
So we get a lot of questions about Dungeons, and I think we've talked about this before. But yeah, Dungeons was not a Chair game. It wasn't something that we were working on. That was being developed by another small studio that we were supporting. We were helping with the game and kind of giving them ideas on it, but um, that was canceled very early on in development, which happens in games, right? Not every game that begins the process of being developed is released, and there's lots of different reasons that can affect whether a game is released or not. That's one that very early on we decided not to continue pursuing, and that's not a game we plan on ever continuing to develop or bring out at any time. So there will not be Infinity Blade Dungeons ever.
So the last question that people ask a lot is about Infinity Blade for Android. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's the first time I've ever heard that question. Haha. No, I think that was the first question that was ever asked about Infinity Blade, and will be asked for a long time. So while Infinity Blade is currently exclusive to iOS, we're always looking for opportunities to expand the Infinity Blade brand, and we are actively looking to bring Infinity Blade to other platforms and hope to be doing so in the future.
Cool. So I know that both you and Jeremy have a big role in the Infinity Blade story, but also I know you got to work with Brandon Sanderson. Can you tell us a little bit about that process before we get into some of these lore
Oh
questions?
man, like how so incredible. So Brandon Sanderson, if you guys don't know, is in my opinion probably the greatest living uh, author today, if not of all authors, like at least of fantasy and science fiction. I think his work is incredible. If you haven't read his work, you should probably stop watching this right now and go get Mistborn or Way of Kings or some of his other amazing novels. So we were huge Brandon Sanderson fans here at Chair, and we're kind of always looking to find really awesome partners to work with, and uh, we're very lucky to be put in a situation where we were able to be introduced to Brandon and get talking, and we hit it off really well. Like
Mm.
we just kind of had very similar interests, and we started talking about the potential of collaborating together to do a book together and to work on the games together, and it was something that we were both super interested in doing. Me most of all, like I was just dying to work with Brandon, and he agreed to do it. He agreed to work with us on the franchise. So he so we'd made Infinity Blade 1, and we were getting ready to make Infinity Blade 2, and we really wanted to. We had definite ideas on the story and the lore and the world, but we thought someone with really the depth of experience of a Brandon Sanderson, who's just, in my opinion, just again so brilliant at creating really well thought out worlds and magic systems and just kind of rule sets that, because we wanted to create a world that felt very believable and real, even though it's totally made up. Spoiler alert, it's not real.
Dang it.
And he was just instrumental in that. I mean, he sat down with Jeremy and I and the rest of the team, and we sat down and we kind of mapped out this, not just this kind of arc of the story of the game, but really built out this foundational world that would make sense and be consistent and have rules, which again I think is a testament to Brandon. It's why, all joking aside, like, we get so many questions about the lore and the world, because it is grounded in so much logic. Internally, it makes sense to itself, and so much of that is because of Brandon. It was the joy of my life to be able to work with him. It was so awesome.
That's really cool. Just so people know, these questions that I'm going to be asking you were submitted previously. If you are watching live, you can hop on the chat, which you'll see to the left or to the right on your window. And there you can actually ask us some questions. We may be able to take some of those towards the end, potentially. But we definitely are going to give priority to these questions that came in before. Again, if you ask questions, we didn't select all of them. We picked and choose, but we definitely, I think, got some really great questions here, and hopefully to fill in some gaps that we haven't done in previous lore conversations.
Sure. Yeah.
So the first one is about QIP, and according to so the question here is from Darkfire7, who's a member of our forums. Which, if you're not part of our forums, go to epicgames.com/forums and and there's the Infinity Blade forums under there. Be sure to join those. There's a lot of great discussions going on there. But the question really focuses around QIP, and it's explained as like a set of memories and personality. But he says that numerous pieces of evidence are given that it affects the physical body as well. How does that work exactly?
So that's a good question, Darkfire. So, yeah, I mean, as we've talked about before, I mean, the quantum identity pattern, the idea behind that, I mean, that was kind of our made-up version of a soul, right? We're like, let's pretend that science discovers what we, many people on Earth currently consider the soul, right? And what if there was actually something akin to a DNA associated with that? And it is that. It's what Tell describes, right? That it is basically the embodiment of your personality, of your memories, of really who you are. But in our mind, it's what if DNA and QIP are kind of inexorably linked, that they really do, those things working together are what makes something what it is. And that if the Deathless had figured out even before the Deathless, if science had figured out how to manipulate both QIP and DNA, that you could start to create, that you could make people live forever, that you could basically turn them into superheroes and give them different powers and different abilities and things like that. And that, over thousands of years, as that technology became prevalent, people would modify their bodies and modify their DNA and modify their QIP in all sorts of unique ways. And so that there would start to be crossover between how those things affect each other. And so I assume what you're referring to is, what we see happen to Thane. So when the worker basically scrambles Thane's QIP, what we see is Thane's body almost start to implode. And the reason for that is because, at least in our mind, Thane is so, for so many thousands of years, I mean, he's living in a 10 to 12 foot tall body that's been super manipulated genetically to basically be this uber being, this uber human. And the genetic modifications required to do that are, a lot of the programming for that is housed in his QIP. And when that becomes scrambled, his body the bones and just all the things in his body that have been manipulated to become that person become no longer function, right? And his whole body starts to collapse and freak out, and the QIP itself starts to mutate his genetics, which is why because actually I think, and maybe I've talked about this before, I think Thane is actually one of the more tragic characters in Infinity Blade because he gets his QIP completely scrambled, but isn't granted the mercy of death, right, by one of the Infinity weapons. And so his QIP is just sitting there completely and forever scrambled and manipulated, and that starts to wreak havoc on the rest of his genes and the rest of his DNA, which is why when we revisit him a few years later, he's this completely mutated creature with no semblance of conscience or even knowing that he's alive anymore. I mean, so it's they're very much linked together. Sorry, that's a long answer to that question.
No, that really makes sense. So going on to the next question, I know that in Infinity Blade 3, the majority of the Infinity weapons are obtained through gameplay.
Yep.
So I think that's kind of the basis of this question, which is how did Cyrus and Issa obtain the Infinity Edge, which is one that you purchase from the store?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So kind of our thinking behind the Infinity Edge was, so my approach to that was purely from a balancing standpoint. As I was looking at the game, I felt like so I really care a lot about symmetry and the way that I try to balance things. And as I was putting in the new weapons, and well, even before the updates, when we were kind of designing the new weapons for the game, we wanted Cyrus and we wanted each of the 6 different fighting styles to have a unique weapon. And I really wanted to set the game up in a way where people were free to play it the way they wanted to. And in my opinion, it wouldn't have been fair if the Infinity Blade, Cyrus could purchase in the store, and Issa would have to find all her weapons in the game. Because again, there's players out there. We have millions and millions of different players. There are some players that maybe aren't going to play as deep into the game as some of you guys, right? And aren't going to necessarily even find those weapons on a quest. And so I knew I needed a weapon to be purchasable in the store. And because of that symmetry, I'm like, if Cyrus is the light weapon, I'll make Issa's the light weapon just to make it balanced. So really, it just came from that, right? I need a weapon in the store. That's what it's going to be. However, the reason I didn't put it in until the update was because we knew when we were... because kind of the whole story conceit is that the worker, once the Infinity Blade was active, had the ability, because of his ring and some of the other stuff he'd programmed, to make more of these weapons. And the reason he did that was because he was trying to sow any sort of confusion and discord among all the different Deathless so that they wouldn't have time to figure out what he was doing and try and gang up on him and imprison him again. I mean, he was super mad, right? Like, the worker, when we see him released from the Vault of Tears, has had so much time to sit in the Vault of Tears and just be super pissed that he was duped by anybody, right? He is not happy with Ausar, and so he's gonna scrub the whole thing, right? He just doesn't want to deal with pesky immortals anymore. And so part of his plan is to obfuscate what he's doing. So he's making these weapons, giving them out to powerful Deathless so that they'll fight amongst themselves and do things. And I think, we worked really hard to establish, kind of in the middle of the story, that Cyrus and Issa are trying to figure out what the worker is doing, or kind of going off together sometimes and alone sometimes, and just kind of and trying to piece together what's going on. So in our mind, Issa, acquired this or found this from one of those other lesser Deathless that was out there, sowing discord and destruction, and she found it that way. But we didn't need to show that. If we ever made it into like a movie or a TV show or something, that would be a cool story to explore. But for gameplay reasons, you bought it.
That's really cool that even with the amount of story, there's still a lot of little side stories that could be explored.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yep.
It's really awesome. Cool. So the next question, I forgot to give credit. That was from Glamdrig804 in the forums, who's pretty active there and good guy. Third we have a question about the Deathless. The question is from Elmlick in our forums as well, and they ask, do the Deathless have children? And if so, what would they be like? And if not, why not?
That is a great question, Elmlick. Very good. So, of course the Deathless can have children. They are human beings like us. So yes, the Deathless can absolutely have children. However, most Deathless choose not to have children. In fact, it's at the time period of Infinity Blade, it's unheard of. Like, no Deathless would risk having a child, because if you have a child, their QIP is going to be very, very similar to yours. And if someone was able to get a hold of one of your children, they could easily reverse engineer their QIP and wreak havoc on you. Even if they couldn't kill you because they don't have an Infinity Blade, but if they could hack your QIP, they could do all sorts of terrible things to you. And so, in our minds, this was something we discussed a lot with Brandon Sanderson early on. We were trying to figure out how the QIP worked, and so when we were doing this, before we even wrote the books, before we wrote the script for Infinity Blade 2, we wrote this, which I shouldn't even tell you. This is going to be mean to tell you guys, but we wrote this about this 50 or 60 page document that was basically the story Bible for Infinity Blade. It basically goes through a lot of these kind of questions, like, what about children? How does that work? What are buds? How does that work? What is the QIP? How do things work together? And just really kind of framing what the world was. And so maybe we'll explore this in future stories, which we think would be cool. But early after the Deathless technology was invented, many of the Deathless, when the first kind of Deathless wars broke out, families were the first thing to go, right? I mean, Deathless were capturing their rivals' children, their spouses, anyone related to them, their nieces, their nephews, cousins, and to try and find access to their QIPs so they could exert power, they could bribe them, they could do all sorts of things. And so that was going on. And what kind of really quickly started to happen was any of the Deathless that were a little more ruthless would go and slaughter their own families, right? Because they don't want, the last thing they would want is someone to get access to their wife or to their children or to their children's children. And so there would be these kind of mass killings where maybe even someone like Ausar participated in something like this, right? Where maybe it wasn't advantageous anymore to have any sort of blood relations. So yeah, I think there's a dark history there of Deathless doing terrible things to their own families to protect themselves selfishly. However, who's to say there's not Deathless out there who fall in love and really want children and have gone to great lengths to keep those bloodlines secret from other people? And that could be some interesting stuff that maybe has been going on in the world and maybe will be explored in any sort of future Infinity Blade stuff. Maybe that has something to do with that statue that Ausar found in his own house.
Sounds like there are more things to be explored potentially in the future. So the next question we have is about the Deathless houses.
Okay.
So far 3 of them have been revealed. According to Vile Majesty from our forums, House Ix, House Burke, and House Core. Can you tell us anything about the 4th Deathless house?
Well, there's many Deathless houses. In Infinity Blade, we're really just kind of exploring, the story of at least the Infinity Blade trilogy is mostly centered around the redemption of Ausar, right? The redemption of, or how Ausar becomes Cyrus. And to frame that story, we're telling it in, kind of a segment of Earth and a segment of the world that is dealing with certain Deathless and other Deathless houses, and it touches on some pretty big moments in the history of the Deathless, but is in no way representative of all the Deathless in the world and what's going on. I think that the concept of deathless houses is cool, something we thought was really cool. And we thought that's how people would tend to organize themselves, right? Where you'd have essentially these kings and queens that would establish their own governments, their own sections of the world that they control and live in, and that there would be these lesser deathless. Like, not every deathless is one of the ruling class. Not everyone can be Raedriar. Not everyone can be Lelendra. Not everyone can be Thane, right? And so, but they would employ and work with other deathless who would kind of join their cause and become part of their house, right? Part of their structure. So I think there is actually, quite a few different deathless houses across the world, many of which we haven't talked about yet. We have given specifics on those three that we've talked about, but we also know that how many members of the Pantheon did we say there were? I think there maybe, I'm trying to remember how many we exactly talked about. But I mean, there's like the Pantheon, right? Which is another organization which would be made up of different houses. So there's all sorts, the Deathless have a very complex and shifting structure of the way they govern themselves in the world. And again, it's a big world and there's not a ton of Deathless, right? We're not talking about millions or even tens of thousands of people. We're talking about a very small group of immortals who rule everything. And there may be other parts of the world that we haven't seen yet that are ruled very, very differently than the Deathless you've encountered so far in the series.
That's interesting. I think I might actually skip forward just one question and we'll just come right back because this seems a little bit related.
Okay.
I'm also asked, what is the world of Pangaea like outside the continent of Pangaea? Does the map show all the land that's currently on the Earth, or is it just one continent and there are additional continents that we're not interacting with?
No, so have you guys figured out yet where Infinity Blade takes place? So if you pull out your maps, we kind of, the way we looked at it is we think that you're kind of looking at, in our imagined future, the waters of, can you actually show that on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I want you guys to, if you want to pull out a map of the world and look at, kind of scroll over to Europe or even kind of like the top of Africa. And we kind of imagine that and this is just our made up science, right? There's no bearing in reality here, that because of the moon's kind of shift and some of the things that have happened to the moon and some of the other things that happened ecologically to the world, that in our future, some of the waters of the world have actually receded. And so we think the landmass of Earth is still pretty similar to what it is today, just with less water. And so, I guess I'm going to point to the screen. You can't see. But imagine that
zoom in on areas maybe.
that you're kind of looking, the bottom half of that map is you're kind of looking at the top of Africa. You're looking at where maybe Egypt would be. You're seeing where, in our mind, I'm pointing at the screen again. Sorry. You're seeing in our mind, so kind of that connecting channel between that water is what would currently be considered Italy, with maybe some of those islands out in the sea there. On the east side of the map, that would be current Spain, and maybe going up a little more into France and the surrounding areas. So this is actually a very, very small sliver of Earth. We're looking at a little bit of Europe, a little bit of Africa, and a little bit of, kind of going over into the east from there. And so there's a lot more of the world out there that we have not shown, and we would love to explore someday.
It's really fascinating. I personally did not realize that as well. Now that you mention it, it's a little clearer, but.
Well, we tried to obfuscate it, right? We didn't want it to be obvious, but we wanted, if someone, if you're really kind of looking at it. And again, we've taken many liberties, and even this map that they have here is not totally accurate, right? This map is only supposed to be a similar or kind of representation of the topology, right? This is their map they use. This still was made by some artisan in the world, right, that may not have a totally accurate view of what the geography actually looks like, but that's what that is.
That's very cool. So there definitely is a vast amount of the world left to.
Oh yeah,
to
no, this is a very
explore.
Small slice of the world.
That's pretty amazing. So we're gonna jump back where we were. So there were a lot of questions along these same kind of lines about kind of the capabilities of your typical Deathless, and Vile Majesty from our forums is asking if we could compare it to kind of well-known comic book superheroes or mythological characters, I guess in terms of abilities and strength.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question. So the kind of the way we think about it is, so I personally like stories and worlds that are built on. I'm cool with them being as crazy and fantastic as they want to be, but I tend to really gravitate towards ones that are a little more, at least have some sort of internal logic, right? I'm not a huge fan of just of magic, and let me explain what I mean when I say that. Like, I'm not a big fan of Deus Ex Machina, where and again, I'm cool with magic and things, but what I don't like is stuff where the magic just seems to be convenient to whatever the character needs in the moment. Where it's like, oh, because Harry Potter's thrown into this situation, all of a sudden now I can do this spell, and whereas if it's more grounded in something where I understand the rules of Logan, right? That's where like X-Men is so cool, right? Like, I understand the rules of Wolverine. He has this and this and this power, and that's it. He's not everything. It's why we have great debates around the office about how, like, I think Superman is great, but I also think Superman is one of the most poorly designed superheroes we've invented, which is probably why he's one of the first ones that we came up with, right? He's just kind of this super being that can do anything, right? And so he's not as interesting as, like, some of our more modern superheroes that have both powers and weaknesses. And if you have someone that can just do everything, it's not as interesting. You can't put them in as many interesting situations. They're just, Superman can just get out of everything, right? Because he's Superman, right? He can do anything, pretty much. And so the escalation of how to make that character interesting becomes a lot harder. So with the Deathless, we wanted to give them some pretty specific limitations. And those limitations being, they're still affected by the realities of the world we live in now. They're still affected by gravity. They're still affected by, they can't, like, when we were talking about teleportation, we're like, well, I think it'd be really cool if science had invented the ability to teleport inorganic matter, but we don't want our Deathless to be so powerful that they can just warp themselves anywhere. And there's lots of cool science fiction. I love Star Trek. I love that they can beam themselves around. And if you even look at like the latest J.J. Abrams versions of Star Trek, they made some really cool, interesting things with teleportation technology. We just wanted ours to be more limited. And so we just try and set up different rules and then force our characters to obey the rules of that world and try and find really interesting ways for them to manipulate those rules. So we're like, teleportation of inorganic objects would be cool, and it would explain some of the things we've shown. If people like summoning swords to themselves. And then in the books, we try and really explore what happens if you exploit that. Cyrus taking the different teleportation discs and assigning them to different things and really kind of manipulating some of the rules that we established for the universe. So I don't know if superhero comparisons are the best. Actually, maybe X-Men would be kind of the best stuff. We try to keep the powers of the Deathless a little more grounded, right? Where it is, what could you achieve through genetic science? And we're definitely taking liberties with what you can achieve with genetic science, right? But that's kind of like the rule in the back of our head, is that this all has to be based in some sort of reality. Even like when we're designing dragons and stuff, we're saying, okay, if someone was able to genetically create a dragon like we represented, what kind of if you were able to take part of an elephant and part of a lobster and part of a bat, like, could you start to make something that could function the way that we were representing it? And granted, we're taking liberties. I don't know how they got to breathe fire, but they did because they're smart. Whatever.
Science, right?
Science. Yeah.
Cool. So I think maybe we could take a few more questions.
Sure. Yeah. Whatever we have time for. Shoot.
Cool.
Go
So
for it.
there were several questions around Lilindra, specifically kind of about her demise. So I think she's maybe one of the most popular kind of villains outside of maybe the core. But so the question from Dan on Facebook was, what exactly happened to Lilindra? Did she die a true death or not in Infinity Blade 3?
Well, it depends on what weapon you had equipped. I'm going to leave that for you guys to decide. So I think Lilindra has been around for a long time and has grown pretty weary of life. And, I think it was really interesting watching her character, when she, she'd just been so embroiled in all the politics and all the games and all the manipulations of the Deathless for so long that that she kind of had this moment where, even instead of, following the worker off the planet to even more manipulations and more adventures and more life, her plan was to just stick it out, right? She did not want to be alive anymore. And, when Cyrus kind of goes to confront her to finish things out, I mean, she's basically asking him to give her release. And I think that we intentionally left that the way it was so that you guys could decide how you think that plays out.
That's interesting.
What do you think Cyrus would do? Right?
That's a really good question, and I think goes down to his character, which I think evolves over the games. So I'm going to go to a few more kind of Facebook questions.
Yeah. Let's do it.
Just real quick, have you guys obviously just want to preface this question with showing Infinity Blade Redemption, which is the second Infinity Blade novel,
Yep.
Which does have some prequel elements to it.
Yeah, it sure does.
There is a question from Joe on Facebook, is if we'd ever consider a prequel novel, or if you'd ever considered, it may mean maybe covering different areas than this one.
Yeah, so I mean, some of the time period that we show in Infinity Blade Redemption is very early on, right at the kind of the cusp of the Deathless technology being discovered, or at least introduced into the modern, or what we would consider the modern world. But yeah, no, we because again, designing kind of those story Bibles and kind of figuring out the shape of the world, we have done a lot of development and thinking about kind of those early few hundred or few thousand years of, kind of how the moon happened and how some of these things came about and the rise of the Deathless. And we think there's actually some amazing stories there. And I would definitely not rule out us exploring that at some time in the future, just because I think there's really interesting stories to tell there.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
This is a question I think you've answered in the past from things that I've read, but I know there's a lot of new players, since we're actually having a sale on the Infinity Blade trilogy right now, so you can get all 3 games for $5, which is an amazing deal. You should go do that for sure.
Lucky you. That's a lot of game for not very much.
That's an amazing deal. But one of the questions that gets brought up a lot is, towards the end of the expansion content for Infinity Blade 3, there's a lot of focus on the moon. And the question from Dane on Facebook is, at the observatory, Sirius finds a base on the moon. Are humans living there, or is it something Asar created?
That is a good question. I wish I could answer it, but I cannot answer that question. It's that's something that, of course, we're setting up, and of course we're teasing you with and alluding to in all sorts of ways. We think that there is very cool stories to be told in the future related to that content. But I think, actually, I guess, to be fair for now, I mean, really, of course, the worker has all sorts of contingencies. it looks to me, I mean, when I saw that image through that telescope, that looked to me like there was green on the moon. And if that's happening, there must be serious technology at play, and there must be at least something is there cultivating life in some form. And I'll let you guys ponder and speculate what you think that is and who could create that and for what purpose. But that's what it looked like to me. It looked like civilization.
That is quite the tease. I guess maybe a final question, and we'll see if there's any in the chat. But Patrick on Facebook says that it seems too easy to become deathless, the process. Is there a reason for that, the ease of that process?
Well, again, I mean, we wanted. So kind of one of the things that was really interesting to us to explore early on, we were just conceptualizing what the story could be for this game we were making, is we thought that, I mean, if you look at the current state of science in real life, so forget fiction for a minute. I mean, we're just making such amazing, groundbreaking discoveries almost every day about how our bodies actually work and how our brains actually work and how DNA actually functions and how genetics rule into different things. And I really believe that the discoveries we are making are going to lead to fascinating results. I think that it stinks. I think I will be like, one of the last people, like by the time they make it, that they're like, yeah, now most people can live to be 200 or 300 years old because of this and this and this. Like, I'll be too old to partake in that, and I'll die like everyone else, and that will suck. But no, I mean, I think we really are going to be making big advances in the longevity of human beings, and we were thinking about that, and we were thinking about, and maybe I'm pretty cynical, but I think if immortality was discovered today, and how interesting would it be if there was some pretty easy process that all of us could become immortal? What would that actually do to our world? Do you think that the governments of the world, do you think that the very rich and powerful people of this world would freely make that available to all the citizens of Earth? I mean, think about the problems that would cause. If all of a sudden everyone could live forever, what would that do to overpopulation? What would that do to food and supply chains and job markets and economies? I mean, that would just wreak havoc on our world. So, and maybe for the better. But I think cynically, right, that if immortality was discovered right now, that would be a hoarded technology. That would not be something that was given freely to the public. That would be kept secret as long as it could. And if and when that became public, like massive wars would break out. And again, just some of the things that's what Infinity Blade is, right? That's kind of our premise. And so we thought it was very interesting if we made that actually becoming deathless was not a big deal. It's actually pretty easy and available technology. And that the hard thing is just getting access to that technology, because the people that have it control it, and they don't want other people to have it because they want to keep that for themselves. We just thought that'd be a cool story.
Definitely. So we do have a couple questions in the chat that might be benign enough. No. One question that we've got right now, just in from Necrode, my eyes are a little bad. But he said he noticed that when reading Redemption, which, again, be sure to pick those up. You can pick them up on iTunes.
Yeah, iTunes and on Amazon, and I think lots of other places as well.
So we've got physical copies here, but there's the digital copy out there for sure. In the book Redemption, Gallus' bodyguard happens to be called Gortol, I guess.
Gortoel.
Gortoel. Sorry,
yeah. It's okay.
I'm blind. Legally, I think. Is this the same Gortoel that is under Radriar's castle?
I think that's a safe assumption. Yeah, that's why. Yeah, we thought that would be a cool nod to show that some of the people in Gallus' kind of inner circle, made it through that era and were given the Deathless gift, and we're still around in the present time, even if Gortoel was a lesser Deathless and had completely manipulated his genes to become much more a monstrosity. But yeah, he began as a human being.
It's really fascinating to see. I think that's one of the coolest part about reading the novels is you get to see the transformation throughout the generations.
Yeah, it's cool.
Cool. So I think we can probably wrap it up there.
Okay.
Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Well, thanks. No, and thank all of you. Like this is so fun and cool that we get to talk about this stuff, and and we wouldn't be talking about any of this if it wasn't for all of your support. I mean, we are just so grateful every day, everyone here at Chair, that for your continued support and your enthusiasm, and for playing our games that we're so lucky to be able to get to make. And I'm just so grateful for all of you, sincerely, all the time. And again, we talked about this earlier, but we are working on something new. It's totally different than Infinity Blade. It's totally different for Chair. We've never done anything like it, but hopefully you'll follow us on that journey as well. I mean, we're making something that we think is really, really, really special and awesome, and we couldn't do any of that without your support. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you again, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, Infinity Blade, the trilogy bundle is on sale right now, so be sure to pick that up on iTunes. And we will be back with the stream on Friday during our kind of regular time. It'll be the same time of day, just on Friday. We're going to get Zach to do another skill challenge, so we'll see if he can survive.
Nice. Better him. You don't want me doing a skill challenge. I'd be like,
don't want me to do
and I'm dead. So.
He's really good at the game.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.